So today I'm with Amy Edmondson, who is the author and professor at Harvard Business School. Amy has written a fantastic book called The Fearless Organization, Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth. She was just named number 3 business thinker in the world by Thinkers 50, and also won the 2019 Breakthrough Idea Award for her work on psychological safety, which is what we're going to talk about. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
Not at all. So we're here live today, which we don't always do outside in live, but we thought we'd do this one live. And if you could just explain to the audience and to our listeners, what is psychological safety?
Psychological safety describes a climate at work, generally, but a climate where one believes that you can freely speak up with any idea, concern, question, even mistakes. So I like to think of it as a sense of permission for candor.
Okay. So why don't people speak up? And there's lots of examples in your book where people, either in front of customers or in front of higher ups, don't say anything, even when lives are at risk. Why is that?
It's kind of crazy. There's interpersonal fear is a very real thing. And so people instinctively, especially around higher ups, worry about what others think of them. And so people will readily speak up when they are 95% sure that what they have to say will be well received. Of course they will, because we want to make a good impression. It's just that big gray zone where people will be more likely to hold back than to speak up. Right? If I'm not sure that what I have to say will be well received, then I'll just wait and see. And also, we have a psychological mechanism, meaning we human beings, called discounting the future. The potential humiliation or embarrassment that I might feel if you don't like what I say looms large, right? And the potential problems that might happen if I don't speak up are quite distanced and minimized by my brain. So that the patient might be harmed, well, that'll happen later, and I don't see it clearly. It's fuzzy in my mind, but I see very clearly the right here, the right now.
So when you started researching this subject some time ago, I believe,
yes,
you started finding out things that really surprised you.
Well, I was a first-year PhD student, and I was really interested in this idea of the learning organization, right? So I wanted to study what the factors were that got in the way of organizations being really learning-oriented, agile, engaged, all of that, right? And I was invited to join a study of medication errors in 2 nearby hospitals, and learning from mistakes always seemed to me a really fun topic. And maybe that makes me a little weird, but I thought it was a central concept in the learning organization. If people are going to make mistakes, organizations are going to make mistakes. If we can't learn from them, we're not learning. And so I thought, okay, sure, I'll go in there and I'll study, these mistakes and how well people learn from them, and that'll be good. And the simple hypothesis I had was that better teams, measured with a standard team effectiveness survey, would make fewer mistakes. And to make a long story short, when I got the data, my survey data, the clinically collected error data, there was a significant correlation between the 2 data sets, which at first seemed like very good news. And then I looked at more carefully, and to my shock and surprise, the correlation was in the wrong direction. In other words, the data were suggesting that better teams, according to a validated survey instrument, had more, not fewer medication errors, which just didn't sit right. And there was no logical explanation for that until it suddenly occurred to me, maybe the better teams don't make more mistakes. Maybe they're more willing and able to talk about them. I mean, they have a sort of healthy human appreciation for the likelihood of error in complex delivery processes, and they're just alert, and they're talking, and they're catching, and they're correcting, and they're doing the best they can.
They weren't actually making more mistakes. They were just talking about
To be honest, initially I couldn't tell you, right?
Right.
Because there was no way, unfortunately, to find out objectively the error rates, because errors are so easy to hide.
Yes.
So if if you're in a punitive climate and you make an error that doesn't directly show up and maybe directly harm someone, you don't tell anybody about it, right? Why would you? In fact, in some settings, people will talk about near misses because it's so much more palatable psychologically, right? It's much easier for me to talk about a near miss, which sounds vaguely heroic, than to talk about a mistake. And by the way, that near miss is a mistake that was caught and corrected.
So can you give us examples of organizations that go around hunting for mistakes, or leaders who go around hunting? Because it's not a natural thing to do.
It's not at all a natural thing to do. And in organizations and in hierarchies, it's very natural to talk about your successes, to talk about what's going well, to give your boss the update, the good report, and not to say, hey, let me tell you about the 10 things that went wrong this week, right? That's not natural. Probably the best known illustration of this is Toyota and the vaunted Toyota production system, which is entirely designed on the premise that things will go wrong, and if we catch and correct them early, we'll have the highest quality, we'll be the best learners, we'll be producing the best products. So in the early days of the first fully owned and managed Toyota production plant in the United States, which is in Georgetown, Kentucky, the plant manager, whose name was Fujio Cho, who, by the way, was later on chairman of Toyota Worldwide. So very impressive guy leading the plant. And there's a young American manager who is new to the company, and he's part of the senior team at the plant, and he comes in Friday staff meetings and reports, some of his successes. As he put it, I boasted a little. And Mr. Cho kind of looked at him, puzzled. Now, I just love that. I love the puzzled, right? Because in no company that I know of does a senior manager look puzzled when a junior manager boasts. That's normal behavior. And he says, Jim-san, we know you're a good manager, or we wouldn't have hired you. But please tell us about your problems so we can work on them together. And in that wonderful phrase, he's saying so much. He's saying, we already know you're good. And by the way, we're pretty sure you're doing your good things. But problem solving is a team sport. And problems are gems. Problems are how we get better every single day.
Right. We'll come on to the importance of leadership in a minute, but I wanted to ask you about customers and the idea of outside in, because customers and customer complaints and customer problems are another source of things to be solved. But do you find that organizations sort of bat these customer truths away? And why do they do that?
There's various old, sayings about percentages, and I don't know what the actual numbers are, but the front line knows that customers are complaining or unhappy or have problems. And then, by the time you get to middle management, half of those are gone. And then by the time you get to the executives, maybe 4% of what's really going on is known by them because of that absolute reluctance to send bad news up the hierarchy. So the customer's real desires, needs, concerns may not be fully known to those in a position to invest in solving them.
Yeah, sure. So what does leadership do about this? So if this is what's going on in every organization around the world, what does a leader, whether they be the CEO or whether they be a team leader, what do they start to do to address some of these issues?
First, make it discussable. We all know this stuff, right? I'm not saying anything new. Everyone in the company doesn't really know. It's undiscussable. Because we're not talking about it, people are getting the message that we're not supposed to talk about it. So name it. As leaders need to be sort of saying, hey, we know things are going wrong out there, and boy, are we eager to hear about it, because it's like Mr. Cho. That's the only way that we will be better tomorrow than we are today.
And when I look around me in corporate America in particular, I see more CEOs who are what I would call rock star celebrity CEOs, who spend an awful lot of time on their profile and standing on stages and, they're kind of like rock stars. Now, you sort of have to be. But how are those people able to also be the humble, curious, empathetic leaders that I think is the sort of leader that you would suggest, or part of their role has to be that?
Part of their role,
Right.
And it's fine to be an evangelist for your company, right? It's fine to be out there and saying, we are doing great things and we're so excited, to be doing them. And by the way, we're innovating every day, or we're trying to innovate every day, which means we're going to get some things wrong on the way to getting other things right. But the real answer is not how can they do that, but how can they not? I mean, they must, right? If you want to stay relevant, you must.
Right.
And so as a leader, you're reminding people, not only that there's uncertainty, there's complexity, there's going to be things that go wrong and right all the time. And we want to hear about it.
Right.
And speed of hearing about it is really important. And then the second and more overt behavior is ask questions, right? Constantly be not just expressing curiosity, but literally saying, what are you seeing out there? And asking specific people, use their name, ask them what they're thinking about, what they're learning about. And then finally make sure your response is a productive response.
Right. You have some great examples in your book where the leaders of the organizations have been excellent at asking for participation. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of participation and the need to have users or staff involved in this stuff?
Sure. I mean, the need to have users and staff involved is that's where the information is. That's
Right.
where the experience
Yeah.
is. So Cynthia Carroll, who came in as the new CEO of Anglo-American South African Mining Company, first of all, first woman CEO in the company's history, not surprising. It's an industry that's definitely not known for female CEOs. And she immediately upon taking this job said, I'm completely unhappy about the worker safety rate. We have an unacceptable number of accidents and even deaths. And that's the number one priority. We're gonna fix that. Of course, people were appalled. It's like, first of all, you can't fix it. It's workers they don't follow instructions. They don't, they're macho. They're not doing their safety protocols. And it's just the way it is around here, right? And she said, nope, it's not going to be the way it is. And rather than doing the obvious thing, which is tightening up the safety rules and letting the workers know you must follow them or else, she essentially invited their voices in. She also announced that and followed through on closing the mine for a solid period of time where they got together to figure out in groups, in teams, how they were going to make it better. And they did.
Give us some of the misconceptions around what psychological safety is and isn't.
Probably the most common misconception, and the one that drives me craziest, is that psychological safety is about being nice. And the reason that one really bugs me is because nice in the corporate world often means I'm going to be nice to your face and say what I think you want to hear. But then in the hallway or with my colleagues or elsewhere, I'm going to say what I really think, which, by the way, isn't very nice. Yeah. However, that's often what nice means at work. And so psychological safety is most certainly not about being nice. In fact, one could say it's quite the opposite. I mean, not exactly, because it's not about being cruel, but it is about being direct. It's certainly about being and helping others be vulnerable. And another one is it's not the same as job security. Right? If we're trying to create a more direct and open and candid workplace, that is not the same thing as don't worry, you have your job for life. We have to be comfortable and open about the fact that the world is changing faster than ever, and business models change, and customers' needs change, and sometimes the skills we need change. And so very few of us, I have tenure, but very few of us do have a job for life. can. We ought to be, we have to learn how to be comfortable with that.
One of the things I like in your book is and there is a 2x2 matrix in there, which
Gotta have it.
You got to have it. But on the one side, it talks about psychological safety, and on the other, it talks about standards or goals or ambition.
Yes.
And you've basically said psychological safety isn't going to solve everything, and that you need standards and ambition and goals as well.
Right. And, I first developed that 2x2 because I was talking about psychological safety, the need for candor, the need the need to make the environment at work, especially for leaders, managers, to make the environment at work a place where people felt able, to speak up. And talk about misconceptions. One immediate pushback is, are you asking me to sort of dial it back on performance standards? Right. And so that was like, no, not at all. That's not. In fact, I don't see those two things as two ends of the same spectrum. High standards over here, high psychological safety over here. I said, in fact, I see it like this. Yeah. I think as a manager, as a leader, you must pay attention to both of these things. I mean, we should have ambition. We should have goals. We should set very ambitious performance standards for people. And there's a variety of ways we might think about doing that. And we need to create a climate where people really know that their voice is welcome. And if you don't do either one, that's kind of a sad state of affairs, right? I call that the apathy zone. This is where people quit and stay. Yep. They're still getting a paycheck, but that's about it. Yep. But the one that I think a lot of executives worry about, they don't want to create the comfort zone, nor do I. Right? They don't want people coming in, lots of psychological safety, but low ambition. And the one I worry about more, however, is what I call the anxiety zone, where standards are high and clear, but people are terrified of speaking up to their boss, to others. And that, to me, is a very dangerous place for any company or organization to be in where there's risk and uncertainty.
Let's talk about one or two of those, Amy, because I think you recognise that Volkswagen under PS was one of those, a company I knew quite well, that people would never say anything to upset the CEO. In fact, barely anyone ever met him. He was a total autocrat. How do organizations think that they're in the right zone when they've got high standards, high ambition, but no psychological safety?
Well, I think it's because they have an erroneous theory of management, which is that fear works. Right? And in fact, certainly Winterkorn, who was at the helm, he at the time of Dieselgate, was very clear, and he learned it from his boss, right? And he was very clear that the best way to get what you want is just say, this is what I want, or else. And truly say things like, I know your names, right? Great, that's gonna work, If I terrify you enough, you'll come up with a genius invention. I don't think so. Nonetheless, it looks like it's working for a while, right? Because we have these Green Car of the Year in 2008, Volkswagen. We now know that was fraudulent. To be generous, I imagine that the very top executives did not know that. Right? They thought they'd put the stake in the ground, they'd been frightening, and they got what they wanted. It's a vestige, it's a faulty theory of management that fear works. They believe, fear motivates. Well, fear does motivate, but it largely motivates hiding.
Yeah. Interesting, because we had Guy Kawasaki on the podcast previously. I was quite surprised because he was Apple's chief evangelist. And I was quite surprised because he basically said he felt that the culture of fear at Apple drove success. And obviously that is an enormously successful company. But in conversation with you, you flatly disagree, Amy. So there's a couple of things to say about that. I think he even also said that the fear of ridicule or humiliation was very effective in helping him do good work. I would disagree. Right? He may have done good work, but we don't have the counterfactual. Like, how good could his work have been
without humiliation, without a threat of humiliation. We don't know that. Second, the research is pretty clear. I mean, they actually manipulate these things in labs and so on. And under conditions of humiliation, people are less creative, do less well on challenging tasks. By the way, they do fine on simple tasks. Right? You know, if I ask you to sort of, stack pens or something, you'll be fine.
Right.
But if I ask you to write an essay, you will not do well. And so, the research is pretty clear that humiliation inhibits performance. And then people have their own sense. They have their own, like he expressed a theory which was, oh, I think I do very well. But you don't know, right? You need a bigger data set to really speak to that. I would suggest that he was able to do really well because of an absolute desire to do well under those conditions, right? I mean, he really wanted to impress Jobs, and he really wanted to, create a fantastic product. And that's more inspirational than fear of humiliation.
So would you go as far as saying that the management models that we're working under still, in many cases, are from the last century? They're from an era when, I think you would call it kind of routine tasks were required. But now we're in a new era where we need more creativity in business. Is that part of the underpinning of your thesis here?
Absolutely, right? So I think in a world where we have more uncertainty, more interdependence, then the ability to speak freely to each other and to get it wrong along the way to getting it right is more important than ever. In a world with very routine, very clear, very transparent tasks, largely done by individuals, you can get away with fear-based management, as Henry Ford certainly did. As your question implied, we've taken that old management paradigm and brought it into the 21st century unconsciously, I think. And so some of it needs to go.
So let's bring our audience in, and I may come back with a question or two at the end, Amy.
You talked a little bit, you shared examples of successes within organizations of psychological safety. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts of creating psychological safety for hearing from the external. And in our context, we're thinking about openness to customers, but beyond that, really external psychological safety.
We were talking a little bit about this before, and I think it's a nice extension. I mean, I think hierarchy and formal hierarchy and having bosses and so on is a bigger risk factor. I mean, customers are generally willing to tell you when they don't like something, and that news might not pass all the way up or pass to where it needs to go. But I think as organizations get more porous, anyway, we're going to have to think more about how do we both receive and then put to good use the voices that are out there, the customers as well. So I think it's an important extension.
I'm curious to understand what you see leaders doing who think they're creating psychological safety for their teams, but what sort of subtle behaviors or actions you might see them doing which actually undermine psychological safety.
That's a great question. I've spent so much more time answering the other question of what leaders can do to create psychological safety. So let me tell you the number one thing that leaders can do to diminish psychological safety where they think they're creating it. So they might start by saying, I really want to hear from you, and then inadvertently do 65% of the talking in the meeting. Right? And when I say inadvertently, I mean it. They are unaware. And unaware of the impact that's having on others, which is both crowding out, but also there's a kind of uncomfortable, he didn't really mean it. Because we tend to think that people are aware of the impact they have, which is wrong. Like we think that we're aware of the impact they have, but that impact may not align sincerely with the intention. Right, so it creates a kind of double bind because it's inhibiting psychological safety, but because the person started out by saying, I really want to hear from you, we believe it to be undiscussable, so we don't mention it.
So you talked a lot today about what leadership can do to create fearlessness. What can everybody else in the organization do? You talked a little bit about reframing the concerns. Are there other things that people could be doing?
Thank you so much for asking that, because I actually believe, bosses have the lion's share of responsibility because their impact can be great. And everyone can do something that can create more psychological safety in their vicinity by speaking up about their passion about the work, characterizing the work as uncertain, saying I might miss something, I'd love to hear from you if I do. That issuing that invitation. The simplest thing is ask questions. When you ask a question and then pause to actually listen to the response, you have just created a momentary platform, an experience of feeling like your voice was welcome. The other person's voice was welcome. So any one of us can ask our colleagues, our managers, our subordinates questions at any time and make a difference.
So, Amy, I have 3 more questions for you.
Excellent.
And then we'll let you go. One is the role of gender. Is this the same for men and women, or does your research bring anything else out that we might be interested in?
So this hasn't been the sort of direct line of my research, but I do have one study where I found statistically significant differences between men and women at work on the following, which is the willingness to speak up with relatively low confidence about the content is much higher for men than women. And so, saying that in another way, women are more likely to hold back at the same level of confidence about the value of what they might say than men. It happens in the classroom, it happens in the workplace. It's a gap I'd love to close.
What does the organization of the future that is most psychologically sound and healthy, what does it look like? Are there examples today that we should be looking at as the world changes?
In my mind's eye, the organization of the future that's healthy, that's vibrant, that's thriving, is one in which everyone working there feels that their unique skills are valued and utilized, right? Put to good use. And they're teaming up in a variety of different ways with different people and just getting work that they believe matters done. Right? So it's fundamentally purpose-driven, it's fundamentally dynamic, it's engaged, it's purposeful, and I think we all want to be put to good use. And so that would be the kind of place where you felt you were being put to good use. Mm.
And I don't know if we can answer this question, but in the world we live in the increasingly divided world we live in, left, right, different creeds and color, how do we create psychological safety again to be able to have conversations where people feel heard and not shouted down?
Through curiosity, which is the twin sister of humility, right? So it's fine to have differences. It's fine to disagree, obviously. It's not fine to not be interested, right? To not be interested in what others are thinking and not want to desire to learn more about it.
Amy, that's a fantastic place to leave our discussion. So on behalf of the audience here and all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Outside In.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.